Dear friends, the last session talked about EU and democracy in the EU and the power of citizens. Now we'll go on to talk about corporations and other illegitimate actors wielding power. I have the pleasure to introduce Susan George, an internationally renowned political scientist and activist who is currently the president of Transnational Institute, but she's also honorary president of ATTAC and been active writing about globalization, international trade, food crisis and shortages, and democracy for the past decades. Susan, please, is going to talk about the danger to democracy that the rise of illegitimate power poses. Susan, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And the discussant will be my good friend, and I'm sure good friend of many of you, Teivo Teivainen. It's always a pleasure to be in Finland and in Helsinki, and I'm extremely grateful to the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation for asking me, and very honored to be here with a very distinguished group of people to try out a subject I've spoken on only once before, and which I'm trying to develop into some sort of book, because I think it's crucial for us as Europeans and as democrats. Usually, as the little introduction says, most people focus on the state and the market. And the market is part of what I'm going to talk about, but I really want to discuss the question of democracy and the interference in democracy of power unaccountable to anyone, except possibly to shareholders, which I think is illegitimate, and where I see more and more signs of this rise of people really running our affairs who have not been elected, and not only have they not been elected, but they are very difficult to identify. The legitimacy, as far as I'm concerned, in running any sort of affair is a degree of democracy. And by democracy, I just say very quickly what I think it has to be. It has to have free and fair elections. It has to have a certain number of attributes like constitutional government, the rule of law, equality before the law, the separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers, all the things that you learned in Political Science 101, right? We all know these things. We all know the basic human rights. These were identified, and they were a very new and revolutionary idea at the end of the 18th century, that individuals have rights. And this was also part of the separation of church and state. The Bill of Rights and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789 and 1791 were extremely revolutionary documents. And the list of rights is still expanding, and it must continue to expand, because in the 18th century we still had slavery, we still had practically no rights for women, etc., etc. And this is a list which should be expanding. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I speak of democracy. I'm not talking today about, shall we say, tyranny or African one-party, one-leader states. No, this is not about, that's not what it's about. It's about the interference of the largest corporations in our affairs. And I'm going to use the term transnational rather than multinational. I use the UN term because I also think that when you get to the top reaches of a company, when you get to the really important things like finance, research and development, and so on, you have a clear nationality which is recognizable, almost always. It's either Swiss or it's French or it's German or it's Finnish, but you can see what it is, and I prefer transnational also for that reason. My hypothesis is that this illegitimate authority is on the rise, that more and more functions of legitimate government are being taken over by the corporations, and I hope to show some proof of this in a series of examples. We have, first of all, why should we defend this model? Why are citizens called upon, in my view, to defend this model? Because there is a new ideology afoot. It's been rising for about the last 20 or 30 years. This is the neoliberal ideology, which is an ideology of selfishness and cruelty. Its ultimate aim is to take down the welfare state. Those who are in charge of running this model and keeping it in the forefront are the 1%, if not the 1/10 of 1%. They have a goal, which I think is becoming clearer and clearer. Their goal is to destroy the character of Europe, the basic character of Europe. And so I'm being very clear at the beginning because I want you to understand where I'm coming from. They want to claw back the achievements of working people over the past 50 or 60 years, and they see this as an ideal moment when many Europeans are in disarray, don't know where to turn. The problem of youth unemployment has been mentioned by previous speakers, and there's a lot more than that. There's the austerity in the South and the disaffection vis-à-vis Europe all over. And we have a very dangerous situation for democracy with the rise of far right-wing parties, extremes, some of which are clearly beyond the pale, not legal at all, like Golden Dawn in Greece. Others are trying to become more respectable. But in any case, I think they are harmful to nearly everyone. And this ideology of neoliberalism is one which has corporations at its center. It has been thoroughly discredited as an economic model. It's been discredited intellectually. Many papers that were the foundation of this have been shown to be completely wrong with fudged figures. It is discredited practically. It doesn't work. If by working we mean improving the lot of 99% or 95% of the citizens, let's be generous, it doesn't work. And morally, it is causing enormous suffering and great hardship in a number of our countries. And yet, it has triumphed. And we have all the signs of this all around us. Inequality has also been mentioned very often. But let me give a concrete example of this and why and how capitalism is winning. I often like to quote Warren Buffett, the third richest man in the world, who said, "There's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's waging this war, and we're winning." And I think Buffett was right, because since the mid-1970s, what has happened, on average in Europe, the GDP of Europe, economists divide the value added to the economy each year into the share that goes to capital in the form of rents, profits, dividends, and the share that goes to labor in the form of wages, salaries, etc., pensions. And since the mid-70s, when the division used to be 70% on average, or a little bit more for labor, and 30% for capital, it's now 60% for labor, down 10%, and 40% for capital, And in many countries, many of our countries, including France, it's more than 40% for capital. Corporate shareholders used to be happy with 3-4% return a year. That was lavish. Now they're demanding 12, 13, sometimes 15% returns on investments. This is impossible to sustain. The former goal of building a healthy, long-lasting enterprise, business, has been overturned. Now the goal is short-term. The goal is shareholder value, in quotes. And what that means is short-termism, asset stripping, mass layoffs, many other negative phenomena. Salaried people have lost 10 points of GDP on average. This is not small change. The GDP of Europe is about $13 trillion. 13 followed by 12 zeros. So that means if working people have lost 10%, that means 1.3 trillion. Now this is important because it's working people's money that keeps the economy ticking over. Working people spend almost all of what they earn. They try to save, of course, but they spend a much higher proportion of what they earn every month on goods and services, simply because they're not paid that much. Capital, and the 1%, or if you prefer the 10%, such people already have much of what they need, and they are putting a lot more into financial products, investing in the markets, but in any case not consumption, which contributes to the real economy. If you buy toxic derivatives, your purchase is making no social difference of any kind to anyone. Many economists will admit this. It's not social or use value. So we are losing a lot, and it's no wonder that the economy isn't ticking over, because we have removed the capacity to buy from the pockets of working people. I'd also like to bring up just a few points, as I made a list for democracy and what we need for authority to be legitimate. I would just like to give a few highlights of what the neoliberal doctrine believes and what it puts forward. Markets. Markets are wise, efficient. They always know what they're doing, and they should always be listened to. They are self-regulating. They don't need government intervention. Regulations are what the doctrine calls job killers, and they use this very effectively. They call the unions, at least in the United States, they call trade unionists thugs, in other words, criminals who are battering the working classes into joining the union, but that these people are also job killers, just like regulations. They're for privatization of all the public services for obvious reasons. That's more money and more power in the capitalist pocket. And they are saying that government spending is intrinsically bad. That was basically the cause of the shutdown in the United States, where this doctrine has gone the furthest. Government deficits must be got rid of as soon as possible. I was amused to hear in the last discussion the figure of 3%, these magic mantra figures of 3 and 60%. Why not 4 and 65? We don't know. Somebody made these figures up in Germany, apparently, 30 years ago, and now they're doctrine, they are. But they don't mean anything in particular. A man in the United States, a representative from Tennessee, voting to cut food stamps for the very poorest people in the United States, had the following thing to say as he voted no to food stamps: "Those who refuse to work shall not eat." Now, does that mean that those people refuse to work, or does that mean that they could not find jobs? This is a question that is not asked. The rich don't owe anything to ordinary people, and the rich don't owe anything to nature either. So you can see, you don't have to be a Marxist to see that the creation of value for neoliberalism comes entirely from investment. It comes entirely from money, from capital. It does not come from work, and it doesn't come from nature. So that, I think, is the basis. That is why there's no respect for the environment, and that is why there is no respect for ordinary working people. So now I'd like to start on my proofs and what I think is happening and give you some examples as talking points that, if you agree with me, you can use, and you can make more, you can deepen much more than I have done so far. And the first step on this ladder is obviously the lobby. Now, lobbies have been around for centuries. The name comes from the lobby of the House of Commons in Great Britain, where from about the beginning of the 18th century there were people hanging around with envelopes stuffed with pound notes, and they were convincing their elected representatives of what they should vote for. That's where the name comes from. And this is now a tradition, so that lobbyists are practically considered part of civil society. Certainly at the European Union they are. In the United States, they are obliged to register with the Congress. You have to say who's paying you, how much, and who, on whose behalf you are talking to elected representatives. In Europe, what we have is a joke. Probably most of you know this, but there is a voluntary register, which is a complete joke, because there's 15 to 20,000 lobbyists in Europe. Nobody knows how many exactly, and almost all of them are lobbying on behalf of a company or a group of companies, a sector of the economy. They are non-elected, and they go through what's called the revolving door. One of the most egregious examples is a former Prime Minister of Ireland, John Bruton, who has now become a lobbyist. He has all the right connections, of course. And there are many, many cases of this, of government service and then lobbying, or lobbying and then government service, etc. So this voluntary register is a complete joke. And what has happened in the past week is even worse, because the European Parliament very properly said, we can't have this anymore. We have to have a working group which will improve our lobbying system, because we're becoming the laughingstock of Europe. So Martin Schulz duly set up a committee, and he named another German, a man called Rainer Wieland, as the chair of this group. And last week, Der Spiegel explained that if the working group had not got anywhere, which is true, it is just standing still, this was possibly because Mr. Rainer Wieland, on the side, is himself a lobbyist. He's a member of a law firm in Brussels which regularly lobbies the Commission. So it's not terribly surprising that this group has got nowhere. And of course, two German Green deputies asked immediately for him to be asked to resign from this position, and possibly from the Parliament, because you're not supposed to have a job on the side. This hasn't been cleared up yet, but that's where we are. So you have the common or garden lobbyist, and these are proliferating, and we don't know exactly what they're doing. It's advancing a little bit, but really at a snail's pace to find out what they're doing and for whom. Just above that class of lobbyists, you have the group lobby. Groups of companies which come together in things they usually call councils or institutes or foundations or centers. You have the Tobacco Council, you have they don't call it the Junk Food Council, but that's what it is, really. It's the food and beverage operation. Usually these are based in Washington, but they always have offices in Brussels and sometimes in other places. And they defend the same sorts of things. They defend alcohol, tobacco, junk food, chemicals, pharmaceuticals. greenhouse gases, vehicles, that sort of thing, but they do it somewhat differently. They employ tame scientists. They pick scientists who are prepared to take money in exchange for writing articles that are on the side of the lobby without confessing any conflict of interest. They write studies to try to create doubt in the public's mind. They create debate where there is no debate. We all know that smoking is harmful, but the tobacco lobby has been able to delay or to cancel legislation for years, and this is still going on. I'll tell you later something about a trial where the tobacco lobby is the main protagonist. They use not just tame scientists, but they create groups out of thin air, supposedly citizens groups. This is what are called, these are called in the United States not grassroots groups, but astroturf groups. I don't know if this is funny in Finnish at all. In sports events, they roll out big rolls of fake grass, which are called astroturf, for sports events, for football and so on. So these are not really grassroots groups. They're not real. They don't come from the roots. They come from the lobbyists making them up, and they're starting to do this in France. I noticed there's a lobby now, supposedly a citizens group for working on Sunday. We want to work on Sunday. There's a group for this, and it somehow turns out to be related to the major right-wing party, but it's an astroturf group. They also collect signatures from ordinary citizens, but when you look very closely, the ordinary citizens are often employees of the various companies like Monsanto. That's one case where it's been shown that Monsanto scientists were signing, but what else could they do? The corporation wanted them to do that. And they also use the scaremongering techniques. They say, if you pass this regulation, it's going to increase the price. If you pass that regulation, it's going to lead to layoffs. It's going to lead to more unemployment in the industry. Anyway, they're very good at this. And they are also very important in the climate change movement, where I am sorry to say they have been extremely effective. If you count the media examples of climate change coverage and global warming coverage, an increase in storms as related to climate change and so on, you will see that statistically it is lower than before Copenhagen in 2009. The public interest in this issue, which is possibly the most crucial ever to confront humanity, is not being treated seriously by the media, and I think this is largely due to the success of the climate change lobby. Now, lots of people have already looked at the question of the banks and the financial industry lobbies. They too have been very successful. From the mid-1990s, the financial lobby in the United States spent $5 billion. That may sound like a lot, but it wasn't a lot for them. And throughout the 90s, they managed to get rid of 12 of the major laws that had been passed by the Roosevelt administration between 1933 and the end of the 30s. The two most important things they got rid of were a law on commodity speculation, which said if you are speculating on wheat, speculating, by the way, is not a dirty word. This has been going on since 1860. But if you speculate on wheat, corn, rice, soya, etc., you have to declare your position, you have to say how many contracts you have bought, and you have to give your name. Now you don't. And you can have as many contracts as you want, you can corner the market, you do not have to declare to anybody because all of these contracts are what are called over-the-counter. That is, I sell you a contract and you buy it and we shake hands and that's that. No register that has, and so when you had a spike in prices in 2008, and we're going to have some more that are coming up, this is very often because of huge speculation on these markets, which does not have to be declared. The other major law they got rid of was the Glass-Steagall Law, which separated banks between investment and commercial banks. The commercial bank where you put your salary check and you write checks on your account, and the investment bank, which is a completely different animal and which does speculate. And the finance minister has spoken about this also. These are very different animals and they ought to be separated. And when they are together, they make an enterprise which is too big to fail, and too big to fail is also too big to jail. You can't put these people in prison. Not a single banker, well, some underlings will go to prison, probably. But the top bankers, they pay their fines. It's a small part of their profits, and they are too big to jail. And this is something also we have to get rid of. So they have been very successful in getting rid of these measures which kept the American economy safe for over 60 years. But now, when something goes wrong with the American economy, it's going wrong all over the place. Another instance of the entry of corporations into the common good, the common weal, are the ratings agencies. You probably know about them. France was just downgraded to AA. It's been downgraded already once. It was AAA, then it became AA+, and now it's just AA. And this is a terrible thing. And there are only 3 major agencies which are contracted by the government, so you can't sell government bonds or certain securities if they don't have a rating from 2 of the top 3 agencies. And that's a law. So they have a wonderful position. But guess what? These are private companies. They're private, transnational companies. Moody's and Standard & Poor make billions of dollars in profits every year. They have offices in more than 20 countries, and they are in charge of saying, you are AAA and you are junk bond. And this is how they were able to sell so many toxics, so many toxic derivatives. They were all packaged very neatly, and they said AAA. And people all over the place bought them because they believed in AAA. Now, the Public Employees Pension Fund of California, called CalPERS, lost $1 billion in contributions from the public employees of the state. They lost it because they bought these securities, which turned out to be absolutely worthless. So they brought a lawsuit against Standard & Poor's. And the lower courts so far have said, now don't laugh, this is absolutely serious, they have said the ratings agencies were only expressing an opinion, and opinion, freedom of opinion, is protected by the First Amendment. And since this corporation was not expressing anything more than an opinion, it cannot be faulted for doing so because it is protected by the Constitution. Now, we don't know if the Supreme Court will say something different, but one certainly hopes so. But this shows the power of these ratings agencies, which are in a position to make or break a country, a corporation, and to allow these terrible securities to be sold. But guess what? Who are they paid by? Not by the government. They're paid by the corporations that ask them to rate their own securities. So there's a certain conflict of interest here too, but this is not usually brought out. Well, I've got details and so on about how much more we have in derivatives and foreign exchange trade and so forth on the market. But I do want to tell you that we have mathematical proof now. This is not just opinion. It's not just me talking. I want to tell you, if you don't know about it, a scientific paper by 3 mathematicians who specialize in complexity theory, and they did something extremely unusual. They started from a basis, a database of 43,000 transnational corporations. They reduced this by taking the connections between these corporations. So they're making a map which looks like the night sky, you know, an astronomical map where you have a huge sun here and planets going around it, and then you have a supernova, and you have all these connections between, it looks like that. The connections upstream and downstream from the corporation. And they narrow down the field by stages to 147 corporations out of the 43,000, which have a huge number of connections, and which together represent 40% of the wealth of the total 43,000. And then, but you have to read the annex to find this, in the annex they list the 50 most connected corporations. And this is what they say about them. I'm quoting. That these companies are the most prone to systemic risk. And what that means is, quote, while in good times the network is seemingly robust, in bad times firms go into distress simultaneously. Now, I hope you're very scared by this. You should be frightened, because Lehman Brothers was a very small example of this. If you have 50 companies on this list, and there are 50, 48 of them are financial companies, either banks or hedge funds or another sort of financial service corporation. And if one goes into distress, they are so interconnected that this is going to be like dominoes that will go just like that. And nobody is worrying about this that I can see at any level which can say, stop it. We have to get this under control, people. So I can give the reference of this mathematical paper. You can skip all the equations. I can't do any math at all. I'm not an economist, but I assure you that you can skip the equations and read the conclusions, which are very, very, very frightening. Okay. Yes, I wanted to talk also about the European Commission, and I would like to ask Dr. Liebherber, I think that's the way it's pronounced, what he thinks about this also. The Commission to prepare the Transatlantic, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact, the TTIP, has had, according to our friends at the Corporate Europe Observatory, they have shown that this preparation involved, and I'm quoting, at least 119 behind closed-door meetings with large corporations and their lobby groups, but has had only a handful of meetings with trade unions and consumer groups. When negotiations were announced in February 2013, not a single such meeting with public interest groups had taken place, compared to dozens with business lobbyists. There is a clear bias in the European Commission for taking the orders, or at least the views, of business, and I could tell you a great deal more about that. But there are now groups which are, well, I'll go back to those groups later, if you'll allow me, because in between I want to say something about another activity of the European Commission. And I would like to take a little survey here of the people here, which is a very intelligent, well-prepared group of people. I know vaguely who you are. How many of you have ever heard of the International Accounting Standards Board. That's very good, but that means about 7 or 8 people. Is that what you got as a count? About 7 or 8 people? 9. Okay, let's be generous. 10. Let's be generous. Okay. And I'm not saying the others ought to know about it because it's very little publicized. There's no real reason for you to know about it except that it's extremely dangerous. Now, this is a group which started off in a perfectly normal way, because here was the European Commission. They were about to enlarge. They were about to have 27 different stock markets, different ways of doing accounts. They had to get their act together. They had to do something to unify this. So they call on the big 4 accounting firms, KPMG, Pricewaterhouse, Ernst & Young, etc., and they say, look, we need to have a unified way of accounting. So these people get together. They say, okay, here you are. Here's how to do it. And lo and behold, a few years later, this quietly morphs, changes its shape into an official body called the International Accounting Standards Board. There was no parliamentary review at all. If anybody asked, which very few people did, they were told this is purely technical. Now, why should you care? Why should a citizen of Europe care? A citizen of Europe should care because unless we get what's called country-by-country reporting in the accounts, it will be virtually impossible to get rid of tax havens. Now, I know there's been progress towards making tax havens accountable, and this is praiseworthy, and this is a very good thing. However, unless we get control over the International Accounting Standards Board, it's going to be a very difficult struggle, because country-by-country reporting means that the tax authorities have to know what a transnational corporation has had as results in every single jurisdiction where it has an office. It has to know what were your sales, how many employees, what were your profits, what tax did you pay. Most corporations now have a system where they say, in our home country, X, we had so much in. We'll give you those figures. And then we have rest of world. That's perfectly legal as things stand. But if you happen to have the way to see that somehow in Bermuda or the Cayman Islands there was a very large profit which involved tens of millions of dollars and a very great loss in Germany or some rich country, you might begin to think this is a little fishy. It's a bit dodgy here. But you can't know that unless you have country-by-country reporting. And what happens is that they can put their profits in low-tax or no-tax jurisdictions, and they can put their losses where the taxes are highest. Now, this isn't just for Europe, because this has become an official body, and it's now making the accounting rules for 66 different countries, including one as far away as Australia from Europe. So I contacted the IASB, and I asked them if country by country was anywhere on their agenda. And I received a very polite answer that no, it wasn't. That this was simply not on the radar anywhere at all. Well, you all know about Starbucks, you all know about Google, you know these big scandals. But these companies are free riders in most places. They've got the police, the fire department to protect their property. They have good roads to bring people to their factories or to truck their goods around the country. They have hospitals and education for their employees. They don't pay their fair share for any of this. That is called being a free rider, and this isn't fair. So we've got to go further and dig further into this matter, because apparently there's something like 32 trillion, 32 with 12 zeros, hiding in the tax havens. Now I want to go back to the TTIP, to the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, because here we have something extremely dangerous, which has just started in Europe. First negotiations of this in July. The second ones are going on next week. And this is a serious matter because this has been in preparation since 1995. Something called the Transatlantic Business Dialogue was created in 1995, and it is now composed of some 70 transnational corporations from both sides of the Atlantic. They have formed working groups which have been at this for nearly 20 years. They have discussed regulations regularly in every sector. This is not a treaty about trade and investment, or only in a very minoritarian way. Trade is already almost free between the United States and Europe. The only two sectors where tariffs are still significant are agriculture and the automotive industry. And there, yes, there's something to discuss at the tariff level. And if Europe opens up to American agricultural goods, it will be the same thing as NAFTA, which is to say it will kill off all of the small farmers of Europe, just as NAFTA killed off the small farmers of Mexico. And that everybody should know. And your own agricultural unions should know this. But our trade is 2 billion a day, 2 billion euros every day, and most of this is free. So it's not really about trade. Investment on both sides comes to about 3 trillion, and that is already very free also. But they want to make it freer. Their main concern is regulations. And by regulations, that takes in public services, that takes in government procurement contracts, that takes in an innumerable number of sectors where consumer protection and health protection are paramount. You pass a regulation because you don't want people to die because of dirty food or dangerous pharmaceuticals, right? You pass a regulation which is justified. You say, we don't want genetically modified organisms because we think they're bad for the environment or they're bad for human health or whatever, but we have good reasons to believe this. In the United States, there is no precautionary principle. You don't say, we stop because we don't know yet, and we need to know better what's going on. In the United States, you say, open it up, and if there's a bad effect, then we'll litigate. We'll have lawsuits. And then we'll see, and the courts will decide. That's not the European way of doing it. So we've got problems on the safety of food, of pharmaceuticals, of chemicals, financial stability proposals. They're going to regulate that kind of issue on investment. Government procurement will have to be open to both sides of the Atlantic at every level. Even if a municipality wants to build a new city hall, that will have to be open to foreign competition. You cannot reserve for local companies or national companies. And the most dangerous thing about this treaty, the very most dangerous thing, is the dispute resolution mechanism. Now, you probably know that at the World Trade Organization, dispute resolution is an in-house arbitration system. It is a government that brings a suit against another government, and they say this regulation in India is unfair, or that law in the United States is unfair, and that's arbitrated, and there's an appeals process, and so on. This is not the way it's going to work if this treaty is passed. It will be only an investor-to-state dispute settlement. That means that the investor can bring a lawsuit against the government if the company believes that its present or expected, in other words, future profits will be harmed by a government measure. 3 minutes, okay? I will finish. These cases are multiplying. Last year, under bilateral investment treaties, there were 62 new cases. That means there are now more than 500 being litigated. This is not in the local court system. This is with special tribunals, with 3 arbitrators, and lawyers who are extremely expensive, and they are also very costly. The biggest settlement so far is Ecuador, which has been told it has to pay Occidental Petroleum $2.4 billion. But many of these awards are over 100 million, and they go in the majority to the corporation and not to the state. The state cannot bring a suit against the investor in front of these arbitration panels. It is the investor that can challenge any ruling by the state. So we are in danger for all kinds of quite proper government measures to protect citizens, including financial measures, including laws about banking. A foreign bank under this treaty could say, I don't want to pay this transactions tax, and bring a lawsuit. So I was going to finish on the United Nations. I'll just say at the United Nations, there is also a group for the transnationals founded by Kofi Annan and Nestle about 15 years ago. And some of us who were mean-spirited began calling Kofi Annan Neskofi Annan at that time. It has grown and mushroomed. Now there are several thousand companies, I think it's 7,000 or 8,000 in this global compact. They have taken over a certain number of departments in the United Nations. They were the biggest delegation in Rio +20 last summer. They said, and here I would like to quote, if I can have just a few more seconds, if I can find the quote. They said, here's what the permanent representative of the International Chamber of Commerce to the United Nations, because the International Chamber of Commerce has a permanent representative, and she said at the Rio +20, we are the largest business delegation ever to attend a UN conference. Business needs to take the lead, and we are taking the lead. And now the companies are demanding an official position in the climate negotiations. So all of this, I think, is a threat to democracy. I think the Davos class, as I call them, the Davos class of the 0.1%, are trying to take over from the states without any accountability, and anyone who values democracy had better watch out and learn about what's happening, because unless you can identify the enemy, there is absolutely no way that you can fight against him. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Ja seuraavaksi meillä on kommentoimassa maailmanpolitiikan professori Teivo Teivainen, joka on kirjoittanut ja tutkinut globalisaatiota, yritysvaltaa ja tässä kesällä kirjoittanut Kalevi Sorsa-säätiölle kirjan Yritysvastuun umpikuja, jota on myös ostettavissa tuolla aulassa, jossa hän käsittelee yritysvastuun ja yritysvallan poliittista luonnetta ja kuinka se on itse asiassa johtaa umpikujaan ja väistämättä, tai toivottavasti ainakin yritysdemokratiaa, mutta Teivo, ole hyvä.
Okay, thank you. You can hear me, right? Yes.
And you speak English.
I'll try to. I'm not very good at
Come
it.
on.
But,
that's a lie, Teivo.
As has been the case for decades for someone who's been very, very inspired by the intellectual consistency of Susan George. In numerous events and reading her texts and books, I was again so impressed by her capacity to point to really key intellectual and political issues of our times, and also to use such wonderful metaphors and analogies. So listening to you, I thought I have to come up with one, even if it's not as great as your Nescoffee and all that. So I was thinking when you said that these corporate entities are free riders of sorts, I thought I'd add to that they are also freedom riders. They are freedom riders in the sense that they ride the legitimating wave of freedom to make authoritarian rule seem legitimate by claiming that their actions through privatization constitute realms of freedom. And your analysis is a great way to show that actually it's about authoritarian systems of rule. The big question here is whether these systems of rule can remain legitimate. And while I agree with just about everything that you said, something you didn't maybe emphasize so much when you at the beginning said that the capitalists are winning.
It's Warren Buffett who said that.
As Warren Buffett said, so I'd like to think like what kinds of cracks there are, what kinds of windows of opportunity this constitutes. If I was more fluent in German philosophy, I might use the term dialectics, but as I'm not, I won't. But I think in the process that you so eloquently describe, when the corporate rule is becoming more visible, the inherently political nature of capitalist corporations is becoming more obvious through movements on the streets from Seattle and before, through the actions of Transnational Institute or Corporate Europe Observatory that have been around for a long time. TNI was founded in the early 1970s.
40 years ago, yeah.
40 years ago with the name Transnational Institute, when nobody was talking, or few people were talking about transnational forms of corporate power. And I'd also like to point to what kinds of contradictions it causes in the system, and in order not to quote only the movements and our friends at TNI and Corporate Europe Observatory, I'd like to reflect for a couple of minutes on Milton Friedman that often comes up in our discussions, and on how something that Milton Friedman said about the time when TNI was founded 40 years ago about power of corporations, and that I find very relevant for today, and that expresses some of the contradictions and shows some of the windows of opportunity. In his most famous text on corporate responsibility, where often we quote him as saying that corporations' only responsibility is to increase the profits of the shareholders, and we leave it at that most often. He says 40 years ago to corporations, never ever start practicing corporate responsibility talk or practice because it's a subversive doctrine, says Milton Friedman 40 years ago. It's a subversive doctrine because by confessing, by claiming that you as corporate ruler, you have responsibilities that go beyond the shareholder value issue, you self-recognize your public role. And Milton Friedman says that in a free society, somebody with public role should be accountable politically and democratically. And that's why Milton Friedman says that it's a subversive doctrine, because through corporate social responsibility doctrine, corporations become open to democratic critique, and that leads to that should lead, says Milton Friedman, to democratization of corporations. And that's why he says it's subversive, never use that doctrine. 40 years later, when Transnational Institute and Milton Friedman were pointing to the power of corporations. We have just about every corporation doing exactly what Milton Friedman warned against, using the corporate responsibility doctrine. And I think with this doctrine, they may have taken one step out of the comfort zone of capitalist legitimacy, because Milton Friedman and myself, we will be there saying, once you've taken that step, you've accepted, at least come halfway to accepting the inherently political role of your power. And in a free society, therefore, whether it's my socialist kind of free society or Milton Friedman's kind of free society, your power should be democratically accountable.
Yeah.
So, how will the corporations respond to that? Either, which is quite unlikely, by saying, yes, you're right, and Milton Friedman, our hero, is right, we should now become democratic and start practicing democratic socialism. Or they may say, sorry, we didn't really mean that the child slaves in the mines of Congo, where the cell phone minerals come from, that we are really responsible for them. It was just lip service, so we take a step back to our sort of realm of economic neutrality. But it's likely that they will try to, because the political role is becoming so much more obvious, because there are people like Susan George who are telling us what their political role consists of. And because the media is today talking about intra-firm trade and talking about all these companies selling and buying to themselves, which shows that the textbook market sort of picture of capitalism is not true, but that capitalism is a politically planned system with authoritarian realms of private power. And in this situation, I think for people who aim at democratic transformations and new democratic revolutions, it would be good to use the analysis both from Milton Friedman and people like Transnational Institute and our friends to show what the politicization of corporate rule means, to take initiative in the debate. And in this, the fact that corporations are freedom riders is very important, because I think the left will not be able to make intellectually consistent and also sort of popularly desirable alternatives unless we take the flag of freedom. And it's very good moment to do that when we have people like Susan George showing us in what sense we can articulate the position that corporate rule constitutes a rule, an authoritarian rule, and therefore privatization is not opening a realm of freedom. And that's why I, for example, sometimes have problems with people who use liber terms to describe really existing capitalism, anything derived from liberalism. I prefer economism, corporate rule, and really existing capitalism and stuff like that, but that's a friendly debate with people who use liber terminology there. And to show that the alternative, the democratic alternatives, the power to the people alternative is actually constituting more freedom than the authoritarian rule of corporate power. So in this sense, I think what Susan has been talking about today points to a very important and central contradiction in the expansion of capitalism when the political nature of its power can no longer be denied, and therefore different ideological currents based on the, like you were pointing to the French Revolution times and all those on liberté, égalité, fraternité, different kinds of intellectual traditions there cannot really help but recognize that fact, and the left should be more aggressively, more intellectually consistent pointing to that in order to build a more democratic world. The details thank you, Susan.
Lead coherent that I think about a quarter of an hour, right, is to give the floor to the It really is to understand what's going on with this TTIP, with this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is a bill of corporate rights. That's what it really is. And it's going, because Europe has so many more good regulations and a much better welfare state than the United States has ever had or ever will have, that if we allow this to happen, the real end goal is integration with a US-type system, which means very little social protection, only for the very poorest people, and a general overhaul of the European model, a destruction of the European model. So this is something we have to understand. We have to bring together coalitions about this in our own countries and also intra and inter-country coalitions to defeat this measure, because it's not well known yet, and the objective, of course, is that it not be well known, just like many other measures that have passed, as we say, like a letter at the post office, and they don't want it to be known because it has been handed down by corporations over the last 20 years. They want it, and they have an incredibly one-track mind where this kind of issue is concerned. We defeated the MAI. Some of you will remember the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. This is much, much worse. We defeated the MAI. We can get this one too, but we have to be aware. So let's give it to the audience.
Okei, eli kysymysten vuoro. Siinä on hänen ja sitten on Sari Varpanen tuolla. Ja lyhyet kysymykset ja kommentit, kiitos.
I understand that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Treaty that was supposed to come to the United States Congress in October, but I don't know if it has been signed. But I think that it's about similar to this treaty.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
But it's been negotiated for 2 years already.
Yeah, yes, but I have understood that the United States Congress has not been able to read the treaty.
No,
so
right.
It has been hidden and it has been tried to convey secretly and without discussion through the Congress. But now this treaty, how is it going to be decided? Is the European Parliament going to discuss it, or how is it going to be decided?
Ratification. It will be ratified by the member countries, which are already on side, and it's being negotiated on the basis of a European mandate, which the Commission wrote for itself, and then sent out to the member countries saying, we would like you to approve of this mandate, which we have written, so that we can open negotiations. And the mandate has been leaked, which is why I know a certain number of things. The texts themselves will be secret. That's the point. But we know that they will have a state-of-the-art investor to state dispute resolution mechanism. We know a certain number of things, and there will be more leaks as time goes on, I hope. But the principle is secrecy. The mandate itself was supposed to be secret, but that got leaked. It was published in the United States in a US publication.
Thank you. Sari?
Thank you. My question is to both of you. Susan George, I remember you well from the Helsinki Process on Globalization and Democracy. And I'd be very interested to hear how you see the change from those days to now. As to what Teivo was saying about how the corporate power is becoming more visible at the moment. So there are cracks in the system, there are ways in which to attend to it. So I'd like to know how the situation has changed. Like we had the World Social Forum and now it seems to have lost momentum. is the movement much weaker? And what could be done in terms of the political system? Because we are just talking about the citizens, but what about the democratic responsibility of the political system overall? Because I think these are two big issues for just citizens to tackle. Of course, they need to put pressure on governments and the political parties, but how could the political system become more transparent and democratic in this respect? And I'd like to hear from Teivo as well, please.
I'll give you that one. You start. Teivo has to start.
Well, of course now, as I said, I believe the corporate power is becoming more visible. So in the public debate, the sort of inter-firm trade issues that have come up and the tax havens and all that, I think they're very useful pedagogically there. But I also believe it's a long process. The sort of enthusiasm in the early 2000s, in some sense, where there was a World Social Forum process emerging as the new game in town, I think it's still important. I think the last World Social Forum organized this year in Tunis showed that the process is still very useful and can give a lot of energy and empower many movements and provide a space of learning, but the excitement of the novelty is over. In Latin America, that became in the early 2000s, there was a left turn in many of the governments. Now, I just came back yesterday from Brazil. I was there for a little bit over a week, and there's a lot of disillusionment in Brazil and in the other left-leaning countries about the left-leaning governments in the region. But still, I think they have shown that it's possible to constitute models where at least some poverty-alleviating mechanisms like Bolsa Familia and others can be constructed. So the sort of excitement of the early 2000s amongst the movements that another world is possible, that was a big thing to sort of destroy the myth of Thatcherism, that there's no alternative. And that was empowering, and it's still there. But then how to create, what does that other world look like, and how do we get there? That's a very long process where the movements are also dividing, because once somebody wins an election and others say, yes, but we don't trust state power, and then you have all kinds of divisions. So in a little bit longer term, I'm probably quite optimistic in the sense that we are in a learning process. It's not like we've gone back to the 90s of the sort of age of golden age of Washington Consensus and all that. There is a clear political debate, and I think the kinds of alternatives that Susan has been so consistently speaking over so many years are here in the debate, and we see them also in the governments. And well, Jutta Urpilainen just left, like we can see examples of some of the ideas coming to governments, even relatively non-progressive governments like the Finnish one. So, but the revolution is not happening tomorrow.
No, well, I'm not looking to a violent revolution, so I'm just as glad that there's no violent revolution. I fear it might come to that in some countries, including my own. I would like to tell you about a very embryonic process, which is called the Alter Summit. Embryonic because it's really still very small. But it is an effort in a great many European countries, including the non-Euro European countries, the Eastern European countries, to bring together social movements, ecologists, feminists, farmers, a great many economists, dissident intellectuals, a great many different sorts of groups, all of whom are disappointed by the present European situation and who have decided to work together because you can bring out 1 million people in Portugal, you can have 3 general strikes in Spain and more than that in Greece, and nothing happens. The European Commission does not give a damn. And what we notice is that if we don't work together, nothing is going to happen because they have no concern whatsoever for democracy and they are not accountable, and there's no way you can force them to be democratic. Therefore, It's important to work together. And I see in many places a more European spirit in which people think, yes, we're French, but we're also Europeans. We're Finnish, but we're also Europeans, etc. And this is very important. I agree with Teivo that the European Social Forum has really disappeared because it didn't work from that point of view. And the last one that took place was really a kind of, well, it was really a failure, let's face it. I was not in Tunis, but everything I've heard about Tunis was terrific. Lots of young people, many, many new faces, and so on. So and just look at the fact that when I try to name the little points of democracy, here are the hallmarks of democracy, count to 10 or something. Everybody wants this. All over the world, people want the same things. This is not a European or Enlightenment thing anymore, right? The Brazilians, because bus fares are going up, but that's not the real reason. They are having a revolt. The Turks, Tahrir Square, and so on. So this is something that's moving, and I never say I'm optimistic or pessimistic, but I say I have hope, because but it's moving much too slowly, and particularly on climate, it's moving much too slowly. And here again, this is going to be a European decision, and the French have got to get their act together, because we're the people who are having this in 2015, and we really have to get together on that one. But I'm not going to go into the past, everything that's happened in the past 10 years, because that's really not the subject. What has happened is that the corporations, that's one thing which I tried to bring out, have acquired a lot more power than they had 10 years ago.
Okay, we got a question in the back.
Addressing Professor George.
I'm not a professor, my dear, I'm sorry, but I've never had a position in a university. I'm just a lady who goes around giving her opinions.
Well, I would like to say that I very much appreciate your speech.
Thank you.
But I would like to raise some points which have not been touched on. First of all, the rise of an information society. For example, computers, an overall change in the mode of production, and the rise of a flexible economy. The globalization, the collapse of Fordist mode of production, so the end of deficit spending policies, which can no longer work in a globalized context. So my question is, don't you think that the rise of neoliberalism goes hand in hand with post-Fordism, and that inequalities are also caused by a change in the mode of production within capitalism? So not only by neoliberal policies.
I missed a word, that neoliberalism goes hand in hand with?
With the post-Fordist mode of production.
Post-Fordist, thank you.
Yeah. So, because my view is that we often blame neoliberalism, but we forget that the real problem is capitalism, which is changing over time. Thank you.
Well, I think it's more than that. I think it's an interesting insight, which I haven't...
David Harvey, as you know, the geographer...
David Harvey, yeah. I hadn't really examined it in those terms, but I did write a book about how the neoliberals in the United States changed what the American people think. And it's a very pragmatic book. It's called Hijacking America. And it's very pragmatic because it just shows how since the middle, well, actually the 1950s, but really getting moving in the 1970s, these people became what I call the right-wing Gramscians. They understood cultural hegemony. They understood that you cannot take power by oppression, by force. You have to get into people's heads. And they set it up so that they could get into people's heads. And they spent about $1 billion, particularly the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and they're still spending a lot of money on think tanks, on recruiting intellectuals for money they had never seen in their entire lives. They got into the publications, everything from the scholarly journal down to the campus newspaper. They invested in universities, the areas where ideas are invented and disseminated, and they decided that that was the way they would do what Gramsci calls make the long march through the institutions. And they have been very successful. And therefore, they frame issues very well. They know how to frame issues so that when I say trade union, half the audience thinks thugs, criminals. If I say reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you say everything get more costly. Life will become more expensive. See, they have their own media now. They have all of this. So partly, yes, of course, it's a reaction to a change in the mode of production, because that allows you, including in Europe, to hire a Bulgarian who makes an average of 153 euros a month, rather than a German or a French person. Yes, sure, that's part of it. The non-Fordist mode of production, where you have to, you can have value chains coming from all over the world. Just a telephone takes at least 22 countries to make it. So I don't even want to think about how many countries for a car, you know. But I think it was also a clearly ideological project which understood itself as an ideological project. That I would add to your own definition.
Thank you. Do you want to say, Teivo, something, or could I pose the last question for you?
Can I just say that even if Susan pointed out that she's not a professor, but she's been recognized by the academic community through ways that most professors can only dream of, for example.
Okay, that's enough, Teivo.
International Political Economy section of the International Studies Association, which is the most important scholarly association in our field. When we had a new award for public scholar, it was quite obvious and very consensual that Susan would be the first recipient
that's thanks
of
to
that,
people like you who infiltrated this wonderful association. You and Barry Gills and other people infiltrating. That's why that happened.
I would like to conclude by asking a question of when we, at the end of the day, leave here, there's a bunch of academics, politicians and political activists, NGO and think tank actors and active citizens. What do you think are the first steps we should take so that we can curtail corporate power and give power back to the people?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, of course. I think education, imitate the right. Learn how to frame issues. Learn how to, first of all, know what you're talking about. And people like Teivo and me are trying to make that easier for people so that you don't have to do all of the spade work, because that's the kind of job that we do. But understanding this stuff, I think, that's part of politics now. I often say, when I started out, you just said, US get out of Vietnam, or stop apartheid, and people agreed with you or they didn't, but they knew what you were talking about. And now if I say, now look, the International Accounting Standards Board is a really important issue because it takes me 5 or 10 minutes to explain what it is. And this is a drawback. So that means popular education is a really important function for NGOs and for activists. We have to get the word out there and do it in a way which is understandable for, you know, the ordinary people, for the people who are who vote, who are concerned, but who don't have time to do. I mean, if you can't identify the enemy, that's what I said at the end. You have to be able to identify who's doing what. And this is one of the things that I think is so undemocratic about Europe as it is now, and why I have turned practically all my attention to Europe, because I'm not working on things like world hunger and the sort of things I worked on years ago, because I think Europe, which is where I live and where I'm a citizen, is totally destroying the concept of democracy, and I want that to change. So to me, what is important is that we force in a place where we can live and vote, that we force change upon these people who are on the side, and clearly so, of the corporations, and who see this as the future. And that's not the future I want. I am a fervent European. I don't want to destroy Europe. I don't want to get out of the euro. I don't want to get out of Europe. But I really want a very different Europe from the one we have now. So that's where I think the fight is for Europeans.
Thanks.
I mean, we need to reinforce inter-European groups like the Alter Summit. I also devote the time I have to that sort of thing.
Thank you. Any
Teivo.
words of wisdom from Teivo, or shall we head
Don't
for
have an
lunch?
idea what we have to do when we go out of here? What do we
Any
have
idea?
to do?
Or
Well, two very brief points. One is to learn from previous struggles. If it's true, as I believe it is, that that corporate power is a form of political power, then let's learn both from the processes where non-political power was made to seem political, like the feminists who politicized patriarchal power by saying the personal is political. What did they do? What did they achieve? What does it mean to say corporate power is political, and how can we make struggles that learn from the feminists in this sense? And also how to learn from those who fought against authoritarian power of states, whether in East Germany or in Chile, when authoritarian governments that seemed to go on forever were taken down. And there were often there were like ideological cracks at the beginning when the rulers said, okay, let's give some new rights, let's let the human rights institutions come here, let's let them open a new newspaper. Nothing will happen, we have it under control. And in almost all cases, finally came out they didn't have it under control. It was from small tactical concessions by the rulers that the movements of democratic transformation were able to use them to have a snowball effect and break down the system. In some sense, fighting against corporate rule, I think if we first recognize that it's being built, the ideological walls that protect authoritarian corporate rules are made by concrete people, just as Berlin Wall was made by concrete people, and they can be brought down by concrete people if we learn to see where the ideological cracks of the system are, and that's where we need Susan to come to Finland many more times to let us see those cracks. Thank you.
thank you.
You said stop making compliments to me all the time. This is embarrassing.
Ja nyt pieni käytännön ilmoitus. Me jatkamme 13:30. We continue at 1:30. Sorry, 13:15 eli 13:15. There is several restaurants in the vicinity. One just when you walk out the door to your right, you have Juttutupa, there are sushi places and other stuff you can attend. But see you here in an hour.